The courtroom was silent. The jury was locked in. And then, right in the middle of Pam Bondi's closing argument, the judge cut her off. Not a whisper. Not a warning. An interruption so sudden it made jurors shift in their seats. What happened next didn't just change the tone of the trial. It shocked the jury, and may have changed the outcome forever. Closing arguments are sacred in a courtroom. They are the final opportunity for an attorney to make their case, to speak directly to the jury without interruption, to present the facts one last time, and to bring everything together into a cohesive, compelling narrative. This is the moment when the attorney's skill, experience, and preparation shine the brightest. They must leave a lasting impression, one that resonates long after the trial is over. This is no ordinary speech, it's the culmination of weeks, sometimes months, of work. Pam Bondi, a seasoned attorney with years of courtroom experience, understood this better than most. She had stood before juries countless times, delivering closing arguments with precision, poise, and authority. She knew the stakes. She knew the weight of her words. And as she stood before the jury in this particular case, she was confident, composed, and ready to deliver a performance that would make the jury remember her words long after they left the courtroom. The case at hand was high profile, drawing attention from both the media and the public. Emotions ran high on both sides, and Bondi knew the jury was likely feeling the pressure. They were tasked with deciding the fate of the defendant, who had been accused of a serious crime. The prosecution had made their case, and now it was her turn to present the defense's arguments. Bondi stood tall at the lectern, her gaze sweeping across the jury box. She made eye contact with each juror, ensuring they knew she was speaking directly to them. Her voice was calm and steady, cutting through the tension in the room. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't raising her voice for dramatic effect. She spoke with authority, and every word seemed carefully chosen. She began by reiterating the key points of the defense. She methodically walked the jury through the evidence, pointing out inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. She highlighted the reasonable doubt that had been raised during the trial, the gaps in the testimony, and the lack of direct evidence linking the defendant to the crime. Her arguments were logical, clear, and well supported. But Bondi knew that closing arguments were not just about the facts. They were about persuasion. They were about telling a story that would stick with the jury, that would make them remember the defendant as more than just a criminal accused of wrongdoing. It was about humanizing the defendant, showing the jury who they were, what they had lost, and why a guilty verdict would not only be unjust, but unfair. As she spoke, she carefully constructed this narrative. She painted a picture of the defendant's life before the accusation, showing the jury a person with a family, a job, a community. She described the toll the trial had taken on them, the emotional strain of sitting through days of testimony, knowing their future was in the hands of 12 strangers. Bondi didn't just want the jury to see the defendant's innocence, she wanted them to feel it. But just as Bondi was building momentum, as her closing argument reached its most powerful point, something unexpected happened. The judge, who had been silent throughout her address, suddenly leaned forward. "Counsel, stop right there." The words sliced through the courtroom like the sharpest of blades. Bondi froze mid-sentence, her mouth still open, her expression one of confusion. The jury, too, looked up in surprise, their eyes shifting between the judge and the attorney, trying to make sense of what was happening. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. The air, thick with tension just moments before, now seemed to freeze in place. Bondi's mind raced. What had just happened? Was there an objection? Was she overstepping some unseen line? The judge's gaze never wavered. His eyes were focused on Bondi, but his voice had lost its usual calm. There was something in his tone, something firm, almost commanding, that made it clear this was not just a routine interruption. "Counsel," the judge said again, this time with more weight in his voice, "I need you to stop. Now." Bondi took a moment to collect herself. The jury was watching, their attention now fully on her. She felt the pressure of the moment, the room's palpable tension pressing down on her shoulders. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now everything was at risk. "Your Honor," she began, attempting to regain control, but the judge raised his hand to stop her. "This is not the time," the judge said, his voice now stern and unyielding. "I'll be addressing this with you privately after we recess." For the first time in the trial, Bondi felt a shift. Her composure faltered, just for a moment. She had planned every word, every gesture, but this, the unexpected interruption, had thrown her off balance. The jury, too, seemed unsettled. The uncertainty in the room was palpable, and Bondi knew it was a critical moment. She had worked so hard to build a case, to craft a narrative, and now, with one simple command, the entire trial had taken an unexpected turn. The judge nodded for the bailiff to call a recess. As the jurors filed out of the room, Bondi stood at the lectern, her mind spinning, trying to understand what had just happened. What had she said that caused the judge to intervene so forcefully? What did it mean for the outcome of the case? As the door to the courtroom swung shut behind the jury, Bondi was left standing alone in the silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew the stakes had never been higher. This wasn't a routine courtroom correction. Judges rarely interrupt closing arguments unless something crosses a serious legal line, misstating evidence, appealing improperly to emotion, or violating a prior ruling. And everyone in the room knew it. Bondi had spent days carefully crafting this moment, fine-tuning her words to build the defense's final argument, to tie together the threads of the case. She'd worked tirelessly to ensure every point was logically sound, every emotional appeal restrained but potent. This was her moment to make her final, lasting impression on the jury, and it was now hanging in the balance. So when the judge suddenly ordered her to stop, the tension in the room was immediate. It wasn't just an interruption, it was an authoritative, pointed command that carried the weight of a courtroom gavel in its delivery. The judge wasn't simply questioning a minor detail or making a procedural correction. He was drawing a line, one that Bondi had to tread carefully if she was to salvage her argument without losing her footing in front of the jury. Bondi didn't react emotionally. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice, though everything in her was likely screaming to do so. Instead, she paused, calm, composed, letting the silence stretch for just long enough to remind everyone in the room that she was in control. She wasn't about to let a misstep undermine her credibility, even if she felt blindsided by the judge's intervention. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head just enough to face the bench. It was an almost imperceptible shift, a subtle movement that conveyed both respect and a silent request for clarification. She was asking, without words, what had gone wrong, what had she said that had caused such a sudden, severe reaction. The judge's voice rang out again, this time clearly enunciating the phrase that would echo through the rest of the trial, straying beyond the record. That phrase carried weight, legal weight, strategic weight, and emotional weight. It wasn't just a simple correction. The words, straying beyond the record, implied that Bondi had made an argument based on facts or assertions that weren't part of the trial evidence. If the judge was right, it could severely undermine her credibility with the jury. Closing arguments were supposed to be a review of the facts presented during the trial, a persuasive summation, not a space for introducing new evidence, hypothetical scenarios, or emotional manipulations unsupported by the record. But if the judge was wrong? If Bondi hadn't actually strayed beyond the record and had merely pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in the argument, then the judge's intervention could be seen as an overreach, an unfair move that could damage the defense's case. It would be perceived as an attempt to silence the defense, to undermine the message she was trying to deliver. The room felt heavier with each passing second. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes flicking between Bondi and the judge. Were they witnessing a correction of a simple mistake, or was Bondi being silenced, cut off at the critical moment, when she was about to deliver the final, most compelling piece of her argument? The jurors were trained to remain impartial, but even the most composed individuals can't help but be swayed by the undercurrents of drama unfolding before them. The judge's sudden intervention, and the quiet tension it had sparked, was a spectacle no one could ignore. Bondi had been poised, confident, leading the jury through the case step by step, and now everything was suspended in a moment of uncertainty. It wasn't just Bondi's credibility on the line, it was the defense's entire argument. In that silence, there was a sense of anticipation that stretched across the room, a collective holding of breath. The defense needed every bit of the emotional weight Bondi was adding to her closing. Every reference to the defendant's life, every appeal to the jury's sense of fairness, these were calculated risks, moments where the facts met the human side of the case. Was that what the judge found objectionable? Was it the emotional appeal that had gone too far, or was there something more technical at play? Bondi wasn't about to let the moment unravel her. After the briefest pause, she straightened, her posture perfect, her expression unchanged. The faintest crease appeared between her brows, but it was the only sign of her inner conflict. She knew this moment could be pivotal. She had to respond, not just to the judge, but to the jury, who had witnessed the interruption and who now needed reassurance that the defense was still on solid ground. With a controlled breath, Bondi addressed the judge, her voice measured but firm. "Your Honor, I believe that my argument has remained within the scope of the evidence presented. If there's any issue with that, I'm happy to address it, but I don't believe I've strayed from the record." Her words were calm, but they carried an undercurrent of quiet defiance. She wasn't backing down, she was asserting her right to make her case. The jury had been watching, and she knew they were paying attention to this back and forth. They would be interpreting every movement, every word, every glance exchanged between the judge and the attorney. Bondi was in the midst of her closing argument, her last opportunity to connect with them before they deliberated. She wasn't going to let this slip away without a fight. The judge, for his part, gave a curt nod, signaling that the matter was settled for the moment. With a wave of his hand, he signaled for the proceedings to resume. The courtroom, though, remained in a state of uneasy quiet as the jury filed back into the room. The air felt charged, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. As the jurors took their seats again, their eyes flicked between Bondi and the judge, waiting for what would happen next. Bondi, her expression once again calm and composed, stepped back to the lectern. Her argument, despite the interruption, had to continue, and the jury's perception of the defense would likely hinge on how she handled the moment. If she could weather this storm and resume with her credibility intact, she might still be able to close strong. But if any doubt lingered in their minds, if they sensed weakness or hesitation, it could be the crack in the defense's foundation they needed to find their guilty verdict. For Bondi, the challenge was clear: to regain control, to reset the tone, and to finish the argument with conviction. The stakes had just gotten even higher. This is where experienced trial lawyers separate themselves from everyone else. In the heat of a courtroom drama, when things could spiral out of control, Bondi didn't push back aggressively. She didn't try to escalate the situation with a sharp retort, nor did she meekly apologize, which would have signaled vulnerability in the face of an unexpected challenge. Instead, she handled the moment with a quiet precision that could only come from years of navigating the high-stakes tension of the courtroom. With calm authority, she addressed the judge's interruption without skipping a beat. "I understand, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "But my argument is directly based on evidence already admitted and testimony already heard. No drama. No defiance. Just a straightforward, fact-based clarification." Her words weren't meant to challenge the judge or undermine his authority, they were a simple statement of fact, a response designed to restore balance to the moment. And in that brief exchange, Bondi accomplished two crucial things. First, she reassured the jury. They had been thrown off balance too, no doubt. The sudden interruption had cast a shadow of doubt, not just on the defense's strategy, but on the trial itself. Was something wrong with the defense's argument? Was Bondi overstepping? Could they trust what they were hearing? These questions were hanging in the air. But when Bondi responded with such calm and precision, it conveyed something important to the jury: an attorney who was in control. Someone who didn't get flustered under pressure, who could face the judge's reprimand without losing her cool. This was the hallmark of experience. Bondi didn't react emotionally, she responded logically. She didn't allow herself to be dragged into a public conflict. Instead, she showed the jury that she was unwavering in her approach, confident enough in her case to state her position and move forward. In that moment, the jury saw not just an attorney, they saw a strategist, someone who could navigate the complexities of a courtroom while maintaining composure. Second, Bondi's measured response preserved the record. In any legal proceeding, preserving the record is paramount. What happens in a courtroom isn't just a matter of what happens in the present, it's about ensuring that everything is properly documented for possible appeals. If this trial were ever challenged, whether by the prosecution or on appeal, Bondi's calm clarification made it clear to the record that she had adhered strictly to the bounds of the evidence. She wasn't introducing anything new, she wasn't stepping outside the lines of what had already been discussed. She was working with what was already on the table. This was no small thing. If the interruption were later cited as grounds for appeal, if the defense claimed that the judge's actions had interfered with their closing argument, Bondi's precise statement would be a safeguard. It would show that, despite the interruption, she had stayed within the rules. It was a subtle move, but one that showed Bondi's understanding of how each word and action in the courtroom would be scrutinized long after the trial was over. For a few seconds, the judge said nothing. He let the silence linger, almost as though weighing the situation, deciding whether to pursue the issue further. Then, after what felt like a pause that stretched far too long, he nodded curtly. "Continue, counsel." And just like that, Bondi was granted the floor again, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. There was a certain tension now, a new dynamic that neither Bondi nor the jury could ignore. What had been a routine closing argument had suddenly become a charged, almost theatrical moment. The judge had asserted his authority, Bondi had quietly, but firmly, asserted hers. And while the jury had come into the room expecting to listen to a closing argument, they were now watching a much more subtle battle unfold. The power struggle wasn't about who had control over the courtroom in the most overt sense, it was a more nuanced game. It was about the control of narrative. In that single moment, the jury wasn't just absorbing facts and figures, they were witnessing a confrontation of wills, a high-stakes battle where every action, every word, and every gesture carried more weight than it might have in any other trial. They could feel the tension, the subtle shifting of power from the judge to Bondi and back again. And in that shifting dynamic, they were being asked to pay attention, not just to the facts, but to the forces at play. Bondi, for her part, wasn't rattled by the change in atmosphere. She stood tall, her presence commanding attention as she continued with her argument. But the tension in the room had grown sharper, and the jurors, who had been somewhat passive listeners up until now, were suddenly more engaged. They leaned in. They hung on every word. Not just because the stakes of the case were high, but because now they were acutely aware of the subtleties in the courtroom, the unspoken power dynamics that could shape the trial's outcome. Bondi, for her part, wasn't rattled by the change in atmosphere. She stood tall, her presence commanding attention as she continued with her argument. But the tension in the room had grown sharper, and the jurors, who had been somewhat passive listeners up until now, were suddenly more engaged. They leaned in. They hung on every word. Not just because the stakes of the case were high, but because now they were acutely aware of the subtleties in the courtroom, the unspoken power dynamics that could shape the trial's outcome. Bondi's calm and strategic response had given her the chance to continue her argument, but it had also pulled the jury into a deeper layer of the trial. They were no longer just hearing a defense lawyer making her case, they were watching a calculated power play between two formidable forces, the judge and the defense attorney. This wasn't a trial where everything could be reduced to simple facts, the drama, the tension, and the personalities were all part of the story unfolding before them. The jury's attention was sharper now. The interruption had forced them to focus, not just on the legal merits of the case, but on the larger narrative at play. Who had control? Who had the last word? Bondi had shown them that she could handle the pressure, but it was no longer just about the argument, it was about who could maneuver more effectively in the space between those arguments. The tension was palpable as Bondi continued. Every juror in the room was acutely aware that they weren't just listening to an argument anymore, they were witnessing a battle of wills, a contest for control over the trial's narrative. This subtle shift had changed the atmosphere, and everyone knew it. It wasn't just a legal contest, it was now a fight for the jury's perception, one that could tip the balance in favor of the defense or the prosecution. And as the trial moved forward, one thing became certain: the jury would remember how Bondi handled this moment. Jurors don't speak during trial, but they notice everything. Every glance, every gesture, every change in tone or demeanor is etched into their minds as they carefully assess the case. They don't need to say anything to communicate their thoughts. Their attention is constant, and they pick up on things that an outside observer might miss. They notice tone. How an attorney speaks, whether they're confident, calm, or frantic, matters far more than we often realize. They notice confidence. The way a lawyer carries themselves under pressure, whether they can handle adversity or crumble under the weight of the moment, speaks volumes to the jury. And perhaps most importantly, they notice when something feels unfair. They sense when the flow of the trial has been interrupted, when an attorney is put at a disadvantage, and how that moment is handled. Jurors are hyper-aware of the subtleties of human behavior, and they understand the stakes even when they can't articulate them in the courtroom. When the judge interrupted Pam Bondi's closing argument, it disrupted the natural flow of her persuasion. Bondi had spent days, weeks, meticulously preparing for this moment. Her closing was meant to be the culmination of everything she had worked toward, a final push to convince the jury of the defendant's innocence. And then, just as she was building momentum, the judge's interruption forced her to stop. That pause could have weakened her case. A less experienced attorney might have become flustered, defensive, or even angry. An attorney who wasn't in control might have let the moment unravel their argument. But Bondi, to the jury's eyes, did something different. She took a breath, remained poised, and responded calmly. What jurors saw wasn't someone who was defensive or out of control. They saw an attorney who was unshaken. Someone who had the composure to handle a disruption and continue on with her case as though nothing had happened. And in a room where emotions often run high, where everyone's nerves are tested to their limits, that composure stood out in sharp contrast. Bondi didn't become flustered or defensive, she appeared controlled. Professional. Unfazed. By not reacting emotionally, she elevated her stature in the jury's eyes. Instead of losing the jury's confidence, Bondi seemed to gain it. She didn't allow the interruption to dictate the tone of the trial. She didn't allow it to shape her narrative. She simply took control of the moment, and that moment was critical. Jurors, who had been quietly observing her every word and movement, were now witnessing a rare moment of courtroom theater, a subtle yet powerful display of self-assurance. Bondi's calm response was more than just a way to address the judge, it was a demonstration of authority and professionalism that reinforced her position. When she resumed speaking, her delivery sharpened. The interruption hadn't thrown her off course, it had refocused her. She slowed her pace. She chose her words more carefully. Every sentence seemed more deliberate, more considered. She spoke with an even greater sense of purpose, as if to show the jury that she wasn't rattled or intimidated by anything that had just happened. The shift wasn't just in the words she spoke, it was in the way she presented herself. She was in control, and she wanted the jury to know it. As she looked at the jury, her eyes locked with theirs in a way that was almost unspoken, but powerfully clear. "You've heard the evidence," her gaze seemed to say. "Trust what you've seen. Trust what you know." She didn't need to shout or emphasize her points more forcefully. Her composed demeanor, the careful pace at which she spoke, and the intensity of her eye contact spoke volumes. The message was simple: I am confident in this case, and so should you be. In a trial, moments like these are rare. Everything about the courtroom is scripted, planned, and rehearsed. Attorneys are trained to follow procedures, to keep their emotions in check, and to make their arguments as clearly as possible. But sometimes, it's the unscripted moments that resonate the most with jurors. It's the moments when an attorney shows a glimpse of who they are, how they handle pressure, and how they deal with the unexpected. Those moments aren't just part of the trial, they are part of the narrative. They tell the jury as much about the attorney's character as the evidence itself. In Bondi's case, the judge's interruption, which could have been a stumbling block, ended up serving as a powerful contrast to her calm and measured response. The interruption highlighted, in some ways, the strength of her argument and her control over the trial. Jurors don't just absorb evidence, they absorb the emotional undercurrent of a trial. And what they saw in Bondi was someone who could not only handle the weight of the case but carry it forward with confidence. Sometimes, interruptions backfire. Instead of diminishing a message, they can end up amplifying it. When a disruption forces an attorney to adjust, it offers them the chance to demonstrate their strength, their professionalism, and their ability to stay grounded when the pressure is on. Bondi's response didn't just preserve the integrity of her argument, it elevated it. The jury could sense that something important was happening. It wasn't just the facts that mattered anymore, it was the way those facts were presented. The way Bondi handled the interruption created an undercurrent of authenticity that made the trial feel more real, more unscripted, and more human. It was a moment of raw professionalism in an otherwise controlled environment. Jurors often come into a trial expecting a predictable, logical presentation of facts. But when something real and unscripted happens, something that wasn't in the trial playbook, it catches their attention in a way nothing else can. As Bondi continued her argument, the tension in the room had shifted. The jury wasn't just listening to a lawyer, they were watching a battle of wills unfold before them. And what they saw was a confident attorney who could handle the unexpected, who could turn a potential setback into an opportunity to reaffirm her strength. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about who could control the narrative, and in that moment, Bondi had taken back control. By the time she finished, the jury didn't just hear her argument. They remembered her composure, her authority, and the way she handled the disruption with grace. Sometimes, it's not just the evidence that wins a case, it's how you respond when the unexpected happens. And in that courtroom, Bondi had turned the interruption into a powerful reinforcement of her argument. The jury knew it. And in that knowledge, they would carry her words with them into deliberation. Trials aren't decided only on facts. They're decided on credibility. Who seemed honest? Who appeared composed under pressure? Who exuded confidence and remained unflappable when the heat was on? These are the questions that linger in the minds of jurors long after the facts and figures have been reviewed, long after the evidence has been presented. The way an attorney handles themselves, their poise, their presence, and their ability to stay calm in the face of adversity, can often make as much of an impression as the arguments they make. In that courtroom, Pam Bondi found herself under the brightest spotlight possible. It wasn't in a moment of triumph. It wasn't when she made a powerful closing argument or when she highlighted the flaws in the prosecution's case. No, Bondi's moment in the spotlight came when the judge interrupted her closing, halting her flow and questioning the direction of her argument. That single disruption could have unraveled her entire strategy. It was a moment where she could have lost control, where she could have shown signs of vulnerability or frustration. But instead, she did the opposite. She didn't flinch. For jurors, that mattered. It mattered deeply. They weren't just evaluating the facts they had heard during the trial. They weren't just looking at the pieces of evidence and trying to fit them together. They were observing the attorney standing before them, the person who was advocating for one side or the other. And in that moment, when the courtroom came to a halt, when all eyes turned toward her, Bondi did something crucial: she maintained her composure. She didn't get defensive. She didn't react emotionally. She didn't escalate the situation. She didn't raise her voice, argue, or try to make a dramatic point. Instead, she stayed measured, poised, and resolute. And that was a signal to the jury that this wasn't a case built on theatrics. This was a case built on substance. Jurors have seen attorneys try to win them over with dramatic gestures, fiery speeches, or calculated emotional appeals. Those can be effective at times, but they're also risky. They can appear overblown, manipulative, or, worse, dishonest. When an attorney veers too far into the realm of theatrics, the jury may begin to question their credibility. But when Bondi faced the judge's interruption, she didn't resort to any of those tactics. She didn't let the situation escalate into a battle of egos. She didn't raise her voice or try to fight for the floor. Instead, she calmly and succinctly clarified that her argument was based directly on the evidence already presented, acknowledging the judge's concerns without undermining her own position. It was a moment that spoke volumes. By remaining calm and composed, Bondi wasn't just preserving her argument, she was proving her credibility. She showed the jury that she wasn't interested in grandstanding or manipulation. Her argument wasn't about emotional appeal or creating spectacle, it was about presenting the truth. Her response conveyed a quiet confidence, a clear message that the case was solid, and the defense was not relying on gimmicks to win the jury's favor. This wasn't a lawyer trying to charm or influence them with flashy rhetoric. This was a professional presenting a well-prepared, thoughtful case. That calm response in the face of adversity had a ripple effect. It reassured the jury. They saw someone who could maintain their composure under pressure. They saw an attorney who wasn't distracted by the unexpected but was instead focused on the task at hand. Jurors could tell that Bondi had control of the situation, and by extension, they could trust that she had control of her case. And this kind of credibility matters. Because when the pressure hits hardest, when the courtroom is filled with tension, jurors need to know who can handle the weight of the moment. They need to know who is in charge, who is steadfast, and who is vulnerable. When a person is pushed to their limits, their true character emerges, and Bondi's response showed the jury exactly who she was. It revealed her integrity and professionalism. It showed them that she wasn't just another attorney throwing out persuasive arguments in hopes of winning the jury over. She was a lawyer who believed in her case, who had prepared every detail, and who was confident enough to let the facts speak for themselves. Whether the verdict ultimately favored her side or not, that moment would be remembered. Not as a disruption, not as a stumble in the trial, but as a test. A test of how an attorney handles the inevitable challenges that arise in every trial. And in that test, Bondi came through with flying colors. She didn't let a momentary setback derail her argument. Instead, she used it to reinforce her credibility. In a sense, the interruption became a powerful demonstration of her character. Sometimes, what happens after the interruption is more persuasive than the argument itself. Jurors know that things don't always go as planned in the courtroom. They know that surprises happen, and unexpected challenges arise. But they also know that the true test of an attorney's skill and integrity is how they respond in those moments. Bondi's measured response showed the jury that she was someone who could withstand pressure, who could stay focused on the facts, and who could handle herself with grace and authority. It wasn't just about the case she was presenting, it was about who she was as an advocate. The interruption, in retrospect, turned out to be a key moment in the trial. It wasn't a mistake or a misstep. It was a chance for Bondi to demonstrate her professionalism, to showcase the substance of her argument and the strength of her character. And in that split second, she won the jury's confidence, not with a flashy argument, but with quiet, unshakable composure. The jury, in turn, would carry that confidence into their deliberations, knowing that the person they were listening to was a seasoned professional who could stand firm even when the pressure was at its highest. That moment, small as it seemed at the time, would become a turning point, not just in the trial, but in the jury's perception of Bondi's credibility and the case she had presented. And for that reason, it mattered more than any single argument she made. If this courtroom moment surprised you, hit like so more people can see it. Share this video with someone who loves real courtroom drama. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more shocking trial moments, legal breakdowns, and stories you won't hear anywhere else. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.